Welcome to the Doña Ana County Clerk's podcast, Preserving History and Democracy. We have a very special guest today. Bern, would you like to introduce our guest?
We are speaking with NMSU BA History graduate Joelle Gonzalez Parra. Thank you for visiting with us and Zooming with us all the way from the nation's capital, and for bringing a great topic to us today for discussion about the Repatriate Colonies of the borderland. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and why the interest in this topic?
Of course. Thank you very much. I have to say I'm very excited. It's the first time I'll give a talk in this format as a podcast. It's not like I have that much experience, but it's still something new I'm excited about. As you mentioned, my name is Joel Gonzalez Parra. I graduated with a BA in History and a BA in Communication Studies from New Mexico State University this past May. So I'm a recent graduate. When it comes to interest in this topic, I was born in Texas, but I was raised in the state of Chihuahua in Mexico and came back for college at New Mexico State University. And during one of my internships about 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, it was an open research internship. I could research any topic I would like to. I was interested in Mexican identity, especially in New Mexico or any area close to the borderland. But when doing some initial readings on that topic, I start seeing those names popping up. Like I already knew about Mesilla. They do a really good job at pointing out the early years of the town and how that came to be. But I was seeing other towns coming up, and that started getting my interest. Towns in Mexico founded exclusively by New Mexican people. Then the topic diverted a little bit, and that's how I ended up focusing on repatriate colonies in Chihuahua by New Mexicans after the Mexican-American War.
Joelle, what is a repatriate colony?
That's a good question because the definition is simple, but it still has there's some people that don't like that concept at all. So when I talk about a repatriate colony, I'm talking about these towns that appeared on the Mexican side of the border after the Mexican-American War, when some people that were in the territories of New Mexico and California decided that they didn't want to stay in what was now U.S. territory. And when I say that some people don't like that concept, I've had the opportunity to talk to other researchers who have looked into these towns before I did. And they mentioned that, when you say repatriate, people usually think about this full cycle of someone leaving their country and then coming back, which wasn't necessarily the case for the people in New Mexico as the war broke out, and they were just there when the border changed, right? But at the end, by repatriate colony, we are still referencing these towns that were created by people who saw themselves now being subjects of a different country and decided that they wanted to remain part of the nation they were part before.
Okay, that kind of answers it, but I want to dive a little deeper. But first, tell us about your methodology and who were some of the important figures in this movement.
For the methodology, there's different aspects I'm looking into here. The first one, I wanted to have a more concrete number of how many people moved to these colonies. Usually previous scholarship on this topic, it's scarce scholarship. But usually the historians that touch on this topic just have like estimates. There's not a concrete number of people that we know about moving to these towns. So I've been looking into census, or padrones, as we're called in Spanish back in the time. I'm looking into those census to try to track the people that moved to these places. And not only how many people moved, but I've also been looking into any type of records that will give me information about geographic the geographic information to know to what extent the places where they live influence their decision in going south of the new border. Economics at the time, how economics played a role into influencing people to stay in the United States or keep the dynamics that they have in Mexico, and also looking into any kind of record that will shed light on cultural influences and to what extent just the anxiety of being ruled by people different to the New Mexicans at the time could have pushed them to relocate.
So, Joel, this happened during the Mexican American War.
Yes.
Can you talk about more about New Mexico's, um, I guess, New Mexico's role in the Mexican American War, including outcomes and what decisions were made on both sides regarding colonies?
So when we talk about the Mexican American War, we are talking about a conflict that took place between 1846 and 1848. And that's pretty much how the whole American Southwest came to be in terms of territory. The position of New Mexico is really interesting because you don't have any major battles taking place in New Mexico. New Mexico was the northern frontier. It was relatively isolated to the rest of the country, that's probably the reason why historians haven't cared too much. Probably to say that they didn't care is like a strong expression, but at least not as much as typical historiography focuses on the main battles and the big cities where many of those decisions were taking place. But New Mexico has a really interesting position because after Mexico gains independence in 1821, Spain usually had restrictions on trade. Spanish territories couldn't trade freely with other nations. Mexico gains independence, decides that they want to get rid of that rule, of that law. So now New Mexico is in a position where they find themselves a little bit closer to the United States, and there's more trade taking place in that area. So Mexico is trying to bring New Mexico into the fold of this broader Mexican culture, what a lot of people at the time, a lot of politicians at the time referred to the Mexican family. But during the Mexican period, which is from 1821 to 1848, we see that many people in New Mexico, it's growing closer to the United States because of the Santa Fe Trail, where they find it easier to buy and sell products that they can get in the territory from the Americans and not from Mexico. Actually, just in the years previous to the war, it is estimated that 70% of New Mexico's territorial budget came from money obtained with through commerce with the Americans. So by the time that the war takes place, you'll find different groups of New Mexican people having very different opinions on whether this invasion and annexation to the United States will be beneficial or not for their interests.
So, what were the main struggles that happened during that time?
So as I mentioned, there were different postures. It's really fascinating to read some of the letters of the time. Again, when you read letters of the time, it's usually from the ruling class. We don't have that many documentation of the ordinary people to have like a first-hand account of what their thoughts were.
Right.
Even within the ruling class, you can see these letters where people are having an open debate of whether what the future for New Mexico is going to look like if it's to remain with the United States. There's, as I mentioned, many examples. There was a priest, Don Francisco Leiva from San Miguel del Vado, and he has a really interesting letter that he writes to Don Asiano Vigil, who served as the governor of the territory during the war. Vigil was a person who was in favor of the Americans taking over. So he receives this letter from this priest from San Miguel del Vado, where he explains, where he touches on different aspects of the debate. He starts by saying that he's always been honest about his opinions towards maintaining the integrity of the Mexican territory. That will be the ideal for him. But then he says, okay, if we don't have other option, if the United States has already taken over, then the best thing for us will be to be a state, not to be a territory.
Right.
And then he goes on arguing about the benefits from being a state, not a territory. And during that part of the letter, you will think, okay, then he's not that close-minded about living under the rule of the American government. But then he has another twist where he says, okay, if we are to be part of the United States, the best thing will be to be a state. That said, I'm old, I speak Spanish, I don't feel like I'm in an age where I can learn the language, the customs, and the laws of the Americans without receiving substantial assistance. So maybe the best thing for me will be to leave New Mexico. So you can see where people, depending on their position, they have many trains of thought, and they have to debate even with themselves whether it's a good idea to remain loyal to Mexico or just accept the new government in the area. There's also other examples of officials during the Mexican period that are being offered positions now under American rule. And a very interesting one is from an official called Vicente Valdez. I can't remember the town right now, but he was like the mayor, the justice of peace of one of the towns in northern New Mexico. He's being called by the Americans to take care of the list, to report lists of militiamen in the territory. And this is even after the war. He's living in New Mexico after the war, but then he replies saying, you know, I have decided to remain a Mexican citizen. So because of my loyalty to the country, I cannot accept any public position here in New Mexico, even if he's still living there. So you see how people is trying to find compromises. They're aiming for their own interest, and when there's some interests that clash, then they're trying to find compromises. Now that they're debating in this idea of not only living in New Mexico, ruled by Americans, but also how they start thinking about citizenship and are they to remain Mexican citizens? Are they to take the U.S. citizenship? And that's something that I can dive a little bit deeper if you would like to later on.
Definitely. Um, but Joel, just to get an idea geographically, what area of New Mexico are we talking about? Is it completely southern New Mexico? Um, like, are we talking about the area that's annexed through the Gadsden Purchase, the Mexican Cession? What area exactly?
Yeah, it's a good thing that you point that out because not the modern boundaries of New Mexico were not all acquired during that war. When New Mexico is annexed to the United States, we're talking about a huge territory that comprised modern day New Mexico, Arizona, and even parts of Colorado, southern Colorado. But even if we have this huge territory, the population was concentrated around the Santa Fe area, Taos, Santa Fe, some people in Albuquerque. That was pretty much it because you have a lot of conflicts with some native groups like the Navajo, for example. So it was hard for New Mexicans to expand beyond that Santa Fe region, which some people refer as the Rio Arriba, region or just northern New Mexico. When we talk about repatriate colonies, though, I already mentioned, I have a small mention to La Mesilla, which is right next to Las Cruces, kind of close to the U.S.-Mexico border. The reason why Mesilla is very well known is because it has this particular history of multiple repatriations. Because you first have Doña Ana. Some people living in Doña Ana decide that they want to relocate south to what they thought was Mexican territory. And they found the town of La Mesilla. But then during the early 1850s, governmental officials realized that the map that was used to define the new US-Mexico border had some mistakes made on that. For example, if you see the current map of the US border, you see that on the east side is a natural border, the Rio Grande or Rio Bravo. And once you reach El Paso, Texas, then you have a more artificial line. Well, that's because El Paso was used as a point of reference initially to draw that border. But the original map located El Paso 40 miles north than it actually was.
Oh, wow.
So all that strip of land that compromises now southern New Mexico and southern Arizona, where La Mesilla happened to be the biggest town. That's why in Mexico we call it La Venta de la Mesilla, the Mesilla purchase. It became contested land again. And in 1854, both the Mexico and the US government decided to settle that issue just by having the US paying $10 million of the time for that strip of land. So when we talk about the US-Mexico War between 1846 and 1848, we are not including that boot hill, as many call it, from New Mexico. It was thought that the border was a little bit higher, and that a natural border will be, for example, the Gila River in Arizona.
Got it. Wow. That's really interesting. So, where were these colonies located that Mexico um, was trying to get people to relocate to?
One of the first ones was La Mesilla. It is thought that people start moving to La Mesilla in 1848, even before there was like an official conclusion to the war. But other historians will say that it was formally established in 1850, again by a lot of people from Doña Ana that saw militiamen being established, American militiamen being established in the town, and other Texans that were given grantlands in the area. They became a little bit anxious about that growing American presence, a little bit anxious about grantlands given by the American government that might not respect the land grants that the New Mexicans had in that area. So they start moving south. And again, because of that, because of those errors that were made in the first map to define the border, the people that founded Mesilla thought that just by crossing the Rio Grande, they were already in Mexico. Because at that time, for the people who is familiar with Las Cruces and Mesilla, now they look like one town because they're right next to each other. The time they were founded as different towns, and there was probably a separation of 5 or 6 miles between town and town. And at the time, the Rio Grande used to cross between those towns. So you have a section of people founding Las Cruces on what they thought was American territory, and a second group of people crossing the river to found La Mesilla, thinking that that was already Mexican territory. And not only was La Mesilla, it was also Santo Tomás de Iturbide, which never fully established itself as a town, but there was land given in that area. Uh, just a little parenthesis. I saw that on YouTube. Your last podcast is with Dr. Araujo, who talks a lot about the salmon farms.
Right.
Part of the original salmon farms was built on some of those grant lands that were given to people in Santo Tomas de Iturbide, thinking about the creation of one of those repatriate colonies. Another town is also La Union, which sits really close to the boundary between New Mexico and Texas. La Union, which was founded as the colony of Nuestra Señora del Refugio. And those are already three little towns that were founded in what's today New Mexico. Again, because of this mistake where it was thought that it was already Mexican land, but then it was given to the United States through the Gadsden Purchase. But not only we have those towns, we do actually have a couple of towns on present-day Chihuahua where New Mexicans and people from Texas too had a lot of influence in the creation of those towns. I'm going to explain it. Let's try to imagine the map. Let's visualize El Paso, modern-day El Paso. If you go south following the Rio Grande, you go across towns like San Elizario, Socorro, Isleta. If you keep going a little bit south, close to modern day Favens in Texas, you have the towns of Guadalupe and San Ignacio, which were also founded by New Mexican people. And these are the towns that were founded in the years following the Mexican-American War. We are talking about 1848 to 1851, 1852. What's interesting is that those are the towns that emerged by New Mexicans right after the war. But the interesting part of this is to see like the border dynamics that are going to start to take place here, because you have some towns being founded immediately after the war, but then depending on how things are going for New Mexicans who decided to stay in the United States, you see other towns being founded way after this series of events. For example, in 1963, you have some people in southern Texas and southern New Mexico who decided to remain in the United States. But then when the Civil War breaks out, they try to create their own colonies following the system that was put in place for those repatriates of the Mexican-American War. And as I mentioned before, Mesilla has this particular history of multiple repatriations because in 1872, we are talking already 14 years after the initial events, there's a lot of political violence taking place in Mesilla. There's a shooting in the plaza, the old plaza that you can visit today. And about 500 individuals of that town decided then to leave Mesilla and go and relocate in what is today La Ascensión in Chihuahua. So yes, we're talking about multiple towns that don't appear immediately after the war, but you see them being formed as New Mexicans and even people from southern Texas are still trying to find their place in the new American dynamics.
That's so interesting because um, the politics was so heavy in this area back then, and you know to to clarify that that was probably a huge part of it. It wasn't just um, personal views. It was different countries' issues. The United States and Mexico must have had a huge influence on how people felt. And so with that, that's a lot of strong feelings. Um, I know about that the violence that took place in Mesilla when they had that rally, for the Democrats, and there was a meeting for Republicans, and they clashed. And yeah, this brings some clarity to that too.
Yeah, that's why when you ask for the methodology, I mentioned many aspects of it. Because immediately after the war, it seems like people are just trying to have a grasp of where they could live better, which country will provide uh, better opportunities for their families. That's why, for example, the Mexican government is giving out free land for the people that relocate. But at the same time, some people realize that it's hard to relocate because if you live in northern New Mexico, sorry, you have to travel, you have to relocate by yourself to get to northern Chihuahua. But you have many native tribes who are constantly raiding the area. Um, American officials in New Mexico made it quite difficult for Mexican officials to try to rally and incite people to move. So there's a lot of politics going on, especially because you have the American and the Mexican government with their own agendas, and in between you have the normal citizen just trying to figure out where they will have the best opportunities or try to sort out the anxiety for the future that is taking place because of the events that are going on.
I have a question for you. So Mexico gave out free land in order to entice people to come. Did the territory of the United States give out anything to people to entice them to stay?
That's an interesting question, and that touches on my previous comment on different agendas. So the Mexican government recognizes that the war is lost. They signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo,
Right.
which is what some of you mentioned earlier as the Mexican Cession. That's where they officially recognize that certain territories of Mexico are going to belong to the United States. And it's then when Mexican officials start to design a plan to say, okay, we lost that territory, but let's try to bring the people in those territories back into Mexico.
Right.
We have to say that it wasn't necessarily a humanitarian project. The Mexican government recognized that one of the reasons why they lost the war or why it was so easy for the United States to invade New Mexico, to pull Texas out of their control, to take California too, is that there was a really low population in that area. Just imagine the whole American Southwest. When it was part of Mexico, it is estimated that the population in all that territory was less than 100,000 people.
Wow. That's a lot of land and very few people.
Very few people, and most of them were actually in New Mexico. It is believed that the first census made by the United States of New Mexico in the year 1850 says that there were 65,000 inhabitants in New Mexico. Um, so Mexico recognizes that very low population in their territories could have been a factor for the United States taking it so easily. So now what they're trying to do is design a plan where they bring that people, especially in New Mexico. New Mexico was like the main target for this plan because most of the population of the time was concentrated there. They're trying to relocate these people, but they don't want these New Mexicans or these Californians to relocate, let's say, in center or south Mexico. They want them to form new towns all along the new border to use them as a barrier for Native Americans who may be raiding the area or as a barrier for future American aggressions.
Right.
And this is going to create some sort of clash with some colonies because again the colonies they're just looking out for their families or for their own persons. So even if they're receiving free land, even if there's a promise of money, tools and seeds to survive, to be granted during the first couple of years of these colonies, they know that they're being relocated in an area that doesn't offer a lot of guarantees when it comes to security, because they're still going to have to fight these Native Americans that they're already been fighting in places like New Mexico, right? So for some of them, it doesn't really make a difference. If that's the main goal of the Mexican government, it doesn't make that much of a difference to stay in New Mexico where they already dealing with these issues instead of relocating, leaving family behind, leaving their neighbors behind, and try to do the same in a new territory. Nonetheless, some people moved. It is estimated that between 1,500 and 3,000 people relocated within the first 2 years after the war. And even if it's not a lot of people, given the population of New Mexico at the time, they still play an interesting role in defining that border area. The American government, on the other hand, didn't really provide, or at least didn't offer, the stuff that the Mexican government offered. It's interesting to see some newspapers of the time, especially newspapers in Santa Fe, where instead of offering or promising something, they just try to remind New Mexicans of the bad situation they used to live in when they were part of Mexico. So you will read newspapers saying stuff like, well, if the Mexican government really cares that much, why don't they use the money that the US gave in compensation for the territories and invested in the people for these colonies? Or they will say stuff like, we are creating forts, we are having our army coming in and taking care of the Native Americans. What's the Mexican government gonna do in that regard if you go to these towns? Uh, so you have the Mexican government promising stuff to try to bring that people in. Well, while the American government is trying to play into those fears and
Yes.
reminding of some New Mexicans of some dire situations that they used to live in, saying, we are a country who is growing a lot economically and size-wise, so why not just be part of that?
You said earlier that Santa Fe had like 70% of the commerce for the territory.
The budget of the territory of New Mexico in the years before the Mexican-American War, that budget was for the whole territory. 70% of that budget came from revenue of the trade with
Wow.
Americans, yes,
Okay.
which was done through the Santa Fe Trail, which connected Independence, Missouri, and Santa Fe in New Mexico.
So that's a lot of commerce.
It was a growing market for sure, because Mexico, especially the most industrialized places in Mexico, aka Mexico City, was too far away from Santa Fe to actually provide for all the tools and needs of the New Mexican people. They found it easier to find that through American merchants. And those American merchants will sometimes even relocate in New Mexico, marry into prominent New Mexican families. So they were slowly getting into not only commerce, but also the politics of the region.
So, Joelle, when people relocated and then that area became the United States, did the U.S. government still acknowledge and recognize people's property rights that they gained from relocating to the Mexican colony?
So that's an interesting question, and I don't have like a really fixed answer to that, because when the United States and Mexico signed the treaty to end the war, they agree on some stipulations that the people in those territories, including New Mexico, have to follow in regard to the decisions that they have to make. One of the biggest ones was about citizenship. If you were living in a territory now annexed by the United States, you have 1 year to decide whether to keep your Mexican citizenship or take the United States one. And if you wanted to remain a Mexican citizen, you had to go to the prefects of your local county and sign up a document acknowledging that you were making that decision. If you didn't do that within a year, you will be by default considered a United States citizen. There were also some stipulations about land grants. The thing is that land grants, in the way that were awarded by Spain and later on Mexico, had some differences, some discrepancies to the system that the United States used. So that did become an issue, especially when it comes to communal land grants. Maybe individual land grants weren't like a big issue, but it was different with those that were awarded to a community or to a group of settlers who were founding a new town before the United States arrived. For example, I mentioned one of the colonies to be Santo Tomás de Iturbide and Nuestra Señora del Refugio, which is today La Unión. Those land grants weren't officially recognized until the early years of the 1900s. So you have land being granted in 1851, 1852 by the Mexican government. It was actually the children and grandchildren of those initial settlers who are receiving recognized titles by the United States.
How they kept it straight, I don't know. I have a feeling they probably didn't for some people.
There were a lot of issues, yeah. I mean, even during the 1970s, you had a couple of riots taking place because some descendants were claiming that they were still having issues to get um, some of those titles recognized. Even to these days, there are still active lawsuits in regard to uh, land grants that were not initially recognized at the time that the war concluded.
We deal with properties and plats and mapping and so forth. So it's kind of critical.
It's past history, but still relevant in some sense, still present.
Yeah. I know, just kind of looking through our real estate records, I did see some deeds from the 1850s and even through the 1970s, uh, from the colony grant to an individual. And I thought that that was really interesting because so much time had passed and they were still uh, issuing deeds from the colony grant to an individual.
Yeah, I mean, and for example, in the case of those towns that were supposed to be for New Mexican repatriates, but then were again part of the US because of the gas and purchase, one of the reasons why it took so long for those land grants to be recognized is because there was some overlapping in the maps with other grants that were granted later on by the American government. Because one of the discrepancies, for example, is that during the Mexican period, it was usually local officials giving out that land, and they wouldn't really measure all those tracts very well. Usually, it was as simple as, like the land of this person starts,
Right.
this hill is at, uh,
Yep.
goes some leagues until you hit like the rock that is right next to the river. So sometimes they were like very vague markers, and that played a role into all the subsequent issues. If you add on top of that that the American government is trying to entice white Americans to come into the territory and giving out some land in those regions, then you have quite a mess taking place right there.
Yes. I think that researching our records, you can probably see that
Yeah.
happen. Yeah. Even our probate records where they had to, go through a judge and claim their land. I think we can see that in our local property records.
Do you
Which
know
I
any?
might have to visit one of these days.
You really do. You really do. I'll promote our records 100%. Are you familiar with the Doniana colony bend?
To an extent, yes.
What was that exactly? Was that um colony had to do with the Mexican government?
So Doñana is actually born as a Mexican colony. It is in 1844, just 2 years before the Mexican-American War takes place, that people in El Paso del Norte, which is modern-day El Paso and Ciudad Juárez in Chihuahua, that was the most populated town slash city in the region. So what local officials are trying to do at that time is try to take small groups of families from the city and have them establishing new towns to serve as this sort of barrier that the Mexican government will try to do later on with people from New Mexico. So Doña Ana, the whole Mesilla Valley and a little bit north of that is identified as a place with good land for agriculture. There are even some rumors that good spots for mines could be there. So in 1844, you have officials from El Paso del Norte, modern day Juarez, giving out grant lands to families who are willing to relocate in that area around the Mesilla Valley. And they found what is today Doña Ana. They found Doña Ana in 1844. And it's from Doña Ana that once the Mexican-American War is taking place, that Texans and militiamen are establishing themselves in Doña Ana, that some people are wary of that, and they start relocating south first to Mesilla and Las Cruces, and later on to La Ascensión in the 1870s.
That's
Amazing.
fascinating.
I know.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
That's our county. Yes.
And just to think that they were crossing the river to get to Mexico.
Right.
Yeah, I guess it's a wild thought for some people today.
What further avenues of research does this topic offer?
A lot, a lot. That's what I will say. So again, right now I'm looking into having a more defined number for the people who relocated there. I'm looking a lot into border dynamics that took place there. Because again, for us today, it's really easy to establish where the border is, what the culture, the language looks like on each side of the border.
Right.
But at this time, we're talking about an area that was almost depopulated. And once people are relocating south to Chihuahua, even if we don't have that much people moving into these towns, just by being on that division line, on that border, they start creating very interesting dynamics. For example, you just joke saying that some people are like crossing the river. At that time, we're crossing the river south to Mexico. But the fact that they were leaving the United States doesn't mean that they didn't want to have anything to do with the United States. In some cases, what you see is that they're just trying to expand influence. For example, in New Mexico, we have one of the biggest Hispanic families in their time were the Oteros. They had a couple of governors. They were instrumental in New Mexico gaining statehood. Well, you have a branch of the Otero family relocating to Guadalupe and Chihuahua, where they became very prominent too. So in some cases, just see these families trying to branch out to gain
Interesting.
influence and see how it plays for them to have in some way a foot on each side of the border. Other examples I can think of are Vicente Cobos. Vicente Cobos, he was one of the first justice of peace in Guadalupe. But then his son, while Vicente was still living in Guadalupe and he died in Guadalupe, being a very prominent citizen of that colony, his son went back to San Elizario in Texas, where he opened a lot of businesses and was very influential, even within Anglo communities in that part of Texas. So it's not as easy as people deciding to be in one place and their decisions being definitive, or completely turning a blind eye to what's happening on the other side. In many
Right.
cases, they're just constantly moving back and forth. They have connections, they have families, they have businesses. If things are going bad in Mexico, they go to the US. If things are bad in the US, they go to Mexico. So I'm really trying to look into the genealogy of some of those families and see how those dynamics played out, and and how much influence they have in creating those border dynamics at the time. Another interesting thing is religion, especially when you see the role that religious people played. For example, when Mexico defined their plan in 1849 to create new colonies with New Mexicans, they sent a commissioner to New Mexico. And the commissioner was a priest, a New Mexican priest called Father Ramon Ortiz. If you go today to La Plaza en Mesilla, you'll see that the historical marker there talks about him being the commissioner in charge to give out the grant lands for the people moving there. But it wasn't only Mesilla, he was also giving grant lands in Chihuahua, for the towns that are still today part of Chihuahua. And he was very instrumental in convincing people to move there. He's actually the one who has a diary. He has a series of letters describing how difficult it was to navigate American officials, because at first American officials were very welcoming to him, thinking that the New Mexicans didn't really want to relocate to Mexico. But then when they saw how easy it was for these priests to attract the people and have them enlisting for repatriation, then they start sending officials to stop him when he was visiting some of the towns. Then they banned him, straight up banned him from being in the
Wow.
territory. But he wasn't the only priest. Later on, you see this really interesting dynamic where people are moving to these towns in Chihuahua, and many times the priests that had an influential role in the town where people are relocating from end up being relocated in those new colonies. In Mesilla, for example, when the riots of 1872 take down the local priest, Jesus de Jose Vaca, and when the people decide to go back to Chihuahua and create the town of La Ascension, one of the first things they do is send a letter to the Diocese of Durango, which was in charge of Durango, Chihuahua, and New Mexico at the time, asking the bishop to relocate the priests that they had over there in this new town. And
Wow.
in other places where many of these priests who were very vocal about American intervention are going back to Mexico, but not to any Mexican town. They're actually following the people of the communities that they used to serve.
So many layers about what happened and how the area was formed and influenced and culturally. That's amazing.
Yes, I think it's a topic that has been overlooked. First, because you have some national narratives, right? For the US, it's kind of sweet to say that when the American army arrived to New Mexico, the New Mexican people did really little to stop them. That, you know, all mentions about the event talk about this bloodless conquest, things on that line. But then you see all these letters where resistance wasn't always uh, military resistance. People are navigating and taking decisions on different bases. The second thing is that because it wasn't a lot of people who relocated, I think it's easy to dismiss the percentage of New Mexicans of the time who relocated. But did play a huge role in defining that border region as we know it today.
I love this topic. This
Yeah,
is a good one, Bern.
this is fiercely interesting. This is the most research I've had to do so that I would understand the topic before I even came and asked you a question. It was a tough time. I grew up in New York, so New Mexico history is new to me, and I had to go way back to just come up with things to discuss with you. Speaking of which, is there anything that we left out that you'd like to bring to our attention?
I don't think so. I think the way that we talk about it, it's a good way, especially for people, as you mentioned, that might not be really familiar with this topic. Because
Yes.
I could go a little bit deeper and throw more numbers, uh, and maybe like more eloquent arguments about some of the layers I was looking into. But I think this is a good way to get people's attention to this topic. Um, for anybody who wants to read more on the matter, Jesus Angel Hernandez has a really good book called Mexican American Repatriation in the 19th Century. Uh, Samuel Cisneros, who is now head of the archives at UNM, University of New Mexico, he has done some work on the colonies that lay today in Chihuahua. So I will recommend anybody who wants to have a deeper dive in that to look into those readings.
Thank you for that.
Yes, thank you, Joelle. That's going to be really beneficial to us and to anybody watching. So.
Well, Joelle, I want to thank you so much for joining us today via Zoom. And as a New Yorker, I miss the East Coast, so I hope you're enjoying yourself there. And as a Las Crucean now, I'm enjoying myself here. So thank you for the history lesson of our area here in the borderlands. And I really appreciate you.
No, thank you for the invitation. I love New Mexico, but it's nice to get out of the desert every once in a while. But I'll be back. I know I'll be back at some point.
Thank you, Joelle. And this has been another episode of the Doña Ana County Clerk's Office podcast, Preserving History and Democracy, where you can find us on YouTube and anywhere else you can watch podcasts. Thank you, everyone.